well, diplomacy is quite fundamental from the very beginning. Our place in the world is a matter of diplomatic relations, international relations, and even global connections from the very beginning. So the outside world is as important as the inside world in the history of the United States. Well, in an official sense, it obviously is with the Revolution. And the first important treaty is the treaty with France in 1778, which, among other things, besides establishing an alliance, actually gave credibility to the existence of this state that has declared in 1776 that it wants to be a part of the world of nations. And so that treaty is a form of recognition of the United States as an entity. Oh, they absolutely knew this. They had Benjamin Franklin he'd been in London trying to fix things first, and then he's in France, and he's pushing. And the French were rather anxious to help. That's the important part. The French had lost a huge war, what we call the French and Indian War, but is more commonly known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. Was an episode actually in a 126-year war, off and on. It used to be called the Great War till World War I, in which France and England were at each other. And in fact, the last phase of that is what we call the War of 1812, but it was really a part of the Napoleonic Wars. And it's only then that we are really not being jerked around by other international powers. Well, Franklin was a very special individual in the world of his time. He was a celebrity as a scientist, but also a charming man and a man of great political insight. In fact, his connections in the world, there's a recent study of Enlightenment figures' correspondence, and only Voltaire had more correspondence than Benjamin Franklin. So he may have been a person out over here in this colony as opposed to the center of the Enlightenment, but he was known and recognized and respected, which was an enormous asset. And his charm counted too, as famously his comfort in the salons of Paris. But it also was a very insightful political thinker. It was absolutely indispensable. In fact, in the Constitutional Convention at one point, Madison remarked that we owe our freedom really to the French. And he said, you know, the great powers through history always fight each other. And the little people get some advantage from that, and that is what helped us, was that France is angry. The 7 Years' War was the first global war. It was fought on every continent, and France lost on every continent. I mean, they were really, really upset. You have an absolutist monarch who's going to funnel money first surreptitiously through Beaumarchais, the musician, composer, to Philadelphia, and then officially with this treaty because of anger over their repeated losses to England. The French alliance was of crucial importance to the colonies. They simply didn't have, they were a small republican entity that nobody in Europe, perhaps Amsterdam, might have, other than Amsterdam, might have liked. The French were allies because of a 126-year war, what turned out to be 126 years. This was at about the 75-year point of wars, a series of wars between France and England. And in the 7 Years' War, or what we call the French and Indian War. France had lost territory to England on every continent in this first global war. And so the king, even before the Treaty of 1778, which was crucial, the king was already surreptitiously sending money through Beaumarchais, the dramatist, to Philadelphia with a front organization. And but the Treaty of 1778 not only brought many more resources, including the French Navy, which would be crucial in Yorktown, but it also effectively recognized the United States as one of the nations in the world of nations. Our diplomats were revolutionaries, rebels. This is a very dangerous position to be in. They were, in fact, though, if they could have been, if the ship that was bringing Adams and Franklin to Paris, if those ships had been intercepted, it would have been a very bad situation. They were traitors, in effect. But they were safe in Paris, and they were able to negotiate. There was tension among them, but particularly Adams and Franklin, or Adams particularly, but they were able to work together, and Franklin was a key figure in all of this. Well, Jefferson was concerned about France because it wasn't just France. Jefferson was a Francophile. This was part of the division between Jefferson and Hamilton. And he was a very strong advocate of the French Revolution, even justifying the terror. But what is happening in the world that he entered into as president was that Britain and France were not allowing the United States to be neutral. Jefferson, often seen as an agrarian, but he was an agrarian who was deeply committed to world trade, free trade. Adam Smith was his mark on that. And it was essential to the American economy, is to have an export. And the conflict, one or the other, would be blockading. If you go trade with France, we're going to blockade you, and vice versa. So he was really stuck in an impossible situation. Well, I'm not sure he was worried about Napoleon's role. He was worried about the French being there. The French were more worrisome in some ways than the Spanish had been. But no, the reason he wanted access to the port of New Orleans because of this agricultural export economy. The exports had to go down the Mississippi River and get into the world market through that port. So he wanted control of that. What made Napoleon ready to sell it, he pretty much forced it on the Americans, and the Americans were smart enough to take it, is the Haitian Revolution, which scared Jefferson to death, practically. In fact, he thought he and his children would be murdered if this kind of revolution continued. But to Napoleon, this meant Saint-Domingue, or today's Haiti, which was the richest place on earth by square foot or acre or square mile in the sugar production, in the very brutal slave system. And when that was gone, Louisiana to Napoleon was the breadbasket to support Haiti, which shouldn't waste any of that land for crops of that sort. So he literally offered it. Jefferson's commission went to Napoleon to get access to New Orleans, not to buy Louisiana. Well, to the surprise of the main negotiator, Livingston, Napoleon says, look, you can have the whole thing. And this was a remarkable situation, and he had to communicate with Jefferson about this, which of course took a while. And Jefferson thought it was not he didn't have that constitutional power. to purchase land like that. It wasn't a part of ordinary diplomacy, which the Secretary of State or whatever could make a treaty. This was a purchase. But he was a so-called strict constructionist of the Constitution. Anything that's not there, explicitly you shouldn't be able to do. But he decided that this was something that was just too important. It would be really transformative. In a way, he had thought that west of the Appalachians, this is before he was president, he had thought that there would probably be other republics, that just as Europe had many countries, that North America would. But once he got a hold of that, not only he, but especially someone like John Quincy Adams, who would be president somewhat later, really had a vision of a continental nation. The Jay Treaty was a very necessary effort by Washington to get the British out of the West. The war was over, but the British were still there. He also wanted trade with the West Indies, which are rather crucial, mainly for Northeast shipping. So he sent John Jay. John Jay was unable to negotiate as strongly as he would have liked. And he came back without getting the British out of the West and without getting trade to the West Indies, but he did get trade to the East Indies, which is not where the Americans wanted it. And that treaty and the whole process of how it should be treated was a crucial dividing point. The partisan voting in Congress for the first time can be statistically identified in the wake of the Jay Treaty. So it was not a very successful treaty, but it was probably as much as he could get. The same issues were the issues in the War of 1812. It is important in the way in which international relations can very powerfully affect domestic politics. The Marshall Plan was one of the most creative foreign policies that the United States has come up with. And it was a recognition that Europe was devastated. It was based upon what was beginning to be what would be called the Cold War, and the fear that the Soviet Union would expand because of the weakness of both Southern Europe and even Western Europe. They did succeed in Eastern Europe. And the idea to build up those economies and those states. But also, incidentally, which is very important to the United States, their economies were essential to the American economy. That is, and the European market, as the Europeans recovered, were extremely important. And this is where the so-called Americanization of Europe comes in, mostly in consumer items and the like. So I think the Marshall Plan was both a political, diplomatic, and economic success. Benjamin Franklin's role in Paris was of enormous importance, in part because of his intellectual and political knowledge and instincts, but also because of his global fame. He was known literally all over the world. Only Voltaire had a larger set of contacts around the world in the Enlightenment. And he had a remarkable charm, and he knew how to play the role of the backwoodsman who's the most cultivated person in the room at the same time. And the salons, which were conducted by the aristocratic women of Paris, there he was a charmer in his fur hat and his outgoing, we'll call it outgoing personality, and an incredible sense of humor, which also played. So he was a an enormous figure in the upper reaches of Paris society and politics.